Welcome to the Freshman Foundation Podcast, helping you make the jump from high school athletics to the collegiate level and beyond, with your host, Michael Huber.
Quarterback is probably the single most important and difficult position in team sports. The position demands athleticism, intelligence, poise, and elite decision-making skills. Those who excel at the position must be truly gifted, and even so, it is not a guarantee of a professional career. My guest on this episode, Bill Burke, is a perfect example of this. Bill played quarterback at Michigan State University, my dear alma mater, from 1996 to 1999. During that time, Bill started at quarterback his final 2 seasons. Bill discusses some of his great wins, including beating number 1 ranked Ohio State in 1998 and beating Tom Brady's highly ranked Michigan team in 1999. He also talks about playing for the legendary Nick Saban. Despite his success, he spent only 1 preseason in the NFL, demonstrating how difficult it is to play quarterback professionally. Bill has moved on to a successful professional life outside of football, including hosting the Dropback podcast, where he interviews former quarterbacks about their experiences and life lessons playing the most difficult position in team sports. I'm excited for this conversation. Let's build your foundation on this bonus episode with Bill Burke. Hey, Bill, how's it going?
Good, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, so even though I've had Coach Boss from Michigan State Baseball on, you are the first official Spartan alum to join the podcast other than the host. It's great to have a fellow Spartan here.
Well, I'm honored. It's always great to talk to somebody who's got the green and white on like you do. And, there's here in Michigan where I live, you never know when you're going to walk around the corner and run into somebody in maize and blue. So it's always good to see a fellow Spartan.
Well, we have a lot of those here in New Jersey too, but there's also more and more Spartans. So it's starting to balance out a little bit. It's interesting because our meeting was a coincidence. I mean, we didn't know each other in college, even though we overlapped. But we just happened to sort of connect online. But can you just, for those listening or not familiar with Michigan State football, and shame on them, can you just tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm originally from Ohio. I've got some roots from really my younger days in Pennsylvania. That's where my parents are from. But I, for the most part, grew up in Ohio, ended up at Michigan State, loved football from the very beginning, from the time I was, 5 years old. And that's really tied in closely to my time in Western Pennsylvania. My parents are from a little town south of Pittsburgh, and this is the late 70s and early 80s when the Pittsburgh Steelers, if you're a football fan, you know what they were doing during those years. They were winning the Super Bowl pretty much every year. And, in those days, there were 3 channels on TV, and for whatever reason, I just gravitated towards sports in general, always had a ball in my hand and loved the sport of football, loved watching the Steelers and Terry Bradshaw and Lynn Swann and all those great names. If you just this past weekend watched the NFL Hall of Fame enshrinement, you saw Troy Polamalu go in. He obviously didn't play at that time, but football has just been a part of my life and sports in general, really, since the very beginning. But grew up in northeastern Ohio, continued to play football every year from the time I was 8 years old. And, there was an organized, football league at that age when I finally moved to Ohio. And so, of course, I was first in line to do that, and loved every minute of it. Loved just anytime I could grabbing somebody to come out in the street in the backyard and just throw the ball around a little bit. So, now I live in Michigan. I obviously went to school at Michigan State, but after a few different stops and a few different, pursuits, I decided to call this home. I met my wife here. She's a Lansing girl. So love it. And now we've got 2 young kids, and we're getting them involved in sports. And so that's basically here we are.
Excellent. So were you always a quarterback?
I was, but interestingly enough, again, going back to the Steelers, I wanted to be a receiver. I wanted to be Lynn Swann. And I remember throwing the football with my dad in the street one day, and he asked me what position I wanted to play, and I said receiver. And he said, nah, you don't want to be a receiver. You want to be a quarterback. Everybody wants to be a quarterback. But at that time, I didn't really know what that meant. I didn't know what it really meant to be a quarterback. I had never played organized football at that point. But as I, started to get into it a little bit, and I started to, learn what it meant. But how I actually became a quarterback, I went out to that first year at 8 years old, and the coach was throwing to all of the kids routes, and everybody was running routes. And, he threw a pass to me. I don't know whether I dropped it or it went over my head, but I picked it up and I threw it back to him. And I guess at that time I had somewhat of a strong arm because the ball went sailing over his head. And he said, why don't you come here and throw these routes to everybody else? And the rest, as they say, is history. And I was a quarterback from that day forward. So never enjoyed playing defense, never enjoyed hitting anybody. I just wanted to have the ball in my hand and throw it as much as I could.
Yeah, as I learned playing football growing up and playing through high school, that if you don't love hitting, football's probably not the game for you unless you play quarterback and can keep yourself clean. Otherwise, you're sticking your nose in it every play. You got to love it.
Yeah, and then when they would put me at defensive back, that's the last line of defense, and I was just praying that somebody up front was going to make the tackle so I didn't have to stick my nose in there. I don't have any shame in saying that now that my career is long over, but yeah, no, I definitely enjoyed the offensive side a lot better.
So in addition to football, did you play other sports growing up?
Played a couple of years of Little League Baseball, wasn't really great at that. I guess I could have pursued pitching a little bit. Could not hit a ball to save my life. Played a couple of years of basketball. That was middle school and ninth grade, but I just got to that point. I realized that, what, I'm going to concentrate on football. It's my number one love. And, that's really what I'm going to do. So, I never looked back, I never regretted it. I've always had some general athletic ability, but, yeah, football was what I knew that I loved. And it's the only thing that I really wanted to concentrate on.
So at what point did you have a sense that, college football, particularly at the level you played at in the Big Ten, was a real possibility?
Well, to be honest with you, Michael, I was really naive. There's so much awareness around all this stuff in recruiting these days. But back then, I didn't have anybody in my family that had played really. And I didn't know what the, what the path was like. So, and in my high school, no matter how talented you were, if you were a freshman and even mostly a sophomore, you didn't play varsity. It was just kind of a situation where, juniors and seniors played and you just kind of waited your turn. But I think I had some talent that really stood out. And so our varsity team wasn't doing all that great. And so finally, some of the assistant coaches convinced the head coach to let me start midway through my sophomore year. We were on the road against a really big Division I opponent. And I ended up playing really well. I think I threw for about 250 yards and a couple touchdowns. And I remember coming off the field after one of those touchdowns and, my teammates were high-fiving me and my backup quarterback at that time, who was older than me, he said, man, you're going to have colleges all over you. You're going to have offers and phone calls and letters. And I didn't, this sounds ridiculous, but I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't know really what a scholarship was. I didn't know how it worked. I watched college football on TV, but I didn't know how you got there or how those guys ended up doing that. So I was really naive about it. But after that, I got my first letter actually that year from George Perlis at Michigan State. But what's funny is I never got another one after that until 3 years later when Nick Saban became the head coach. So it was kind of weird that I ended up there at Michigan State and I got my first letter from that school, but there was some in-between time there where, I really wasn't in communication with the school at all.
It's interesting now because, like you said, there's so much more awareness around the recruiting process. But even now, what I find with families is if a parent, one or both of the parents didn't go through the recruiting process as an athlete, even still, it's hard for parents to figure out, even though it's much more transparent than it was, 25 years ago. So I can only imagine what it was like for you, when you were being recruited in the 90s. Like, did your parents, were they athletes or did they have an athletic background?
No, not at all. Neither one played high school sports. I know that, once it was kind of known that I had some talent, there was I believe a recruiting service, that you could pay some money. They would offer to get your name out there. So we signed up for that. I don't know how much that actually helped me. I tend to think that if you're talented enough, people are going to find you. So we did that. My parents wanted to give me every option, to be successful, and I certainly thank them for that. But no, there was nobody really guiding me, and there wasn't a ton of big time athletes that came out of my school, even though we were somewhat of a bigger school. It was kind of the Wild West, and I was just kind of figuring it out as I went, and really didn't know the ins and outs of it, but just feel fortunate to have landed where I did. Because there for a while I thought I was going to have just 100 options, of big time schools, and it didn't really pan out that way. But I'm lucky to have landed at Michigan State.
So what did the process look like? I mean, what were your choices, and sort of how did you narrow it down to the point where you said, okay, Michigan State's the place I want to be?
Well, I always dreamt about playing major Division I college football. I wanted to go to a big school. And I think I let that be known pretty early on. I think I could have had a lot of offers and opportunities at maybe MAC schools. But when it came time to play or to get offers from schools like Michigan State, the Big Ten, and other major conferences around the country, there really weren't a lot of those. And I had an official visit set up to the University of Maryland, which I really liked because at the time they were running an offense called the run and shoot, and they threw a ball a lot. I really liked that. They recruited me the heaviest out of anyone. I mean, I got constant letters and phone calls. Even went down there just on my own during the summer just to check things out. But when it came time to take my official visit, I was there on campus. I talked to the head coaches, and I came away from that visit without any scholarship offers. And I was really wanting to go there. So I actually called up the coaches after the visit, and I said, hey, I want to come here. And they said, we're sorry, we just don't have a scholarship for you. We actually are going to take another quarterback. And so I was pretty devastated by that. I had an official visit set up to the University of Minnesota as well. And if I remember correctly, they were going to have a scholarship for me. Didn't really want to go there. Their program wasn't even what it is today. Still further north in Michigan. The weather, the snow doesn't really appeal to me, even though I've been in the Midwest my entire life and live in Michigan now. But once Nick Saban took over at Michigan State, they were kind of scrambling to, put together a recruiting class. He was a coach with the Cleveland Browns, and they were in the playoffs that year. So he had to wait till his season was done before he could kind of get his staff together and start recruiting for Michigan State. So it was late in the game, and I was starting to panic a little bit. I certainly, I think, would have had some college football options, maybe at a lower level, but really wanted to be at a big time school. And so once Nick Saban assembled a staff, I got a phone call, had a meeting with a coach at my house. He asked me for some tape. He told me that if I sent that in and our offense coordinator liked what he saw, then they'd have me up for an official visit. And, I was sitting on the edge of my seat waiting for that call and hoping that they liked what they saw. He called me, said they did like it, which I was very relieved to hear. And so we scheduled that visit. That was in January. And when I was up there, and now I made sure to ask the coaching staff, do I have a scholarship here because of what happened with Maryland? I didn't really know what I was getting into. So I wanted to make sure that I communicated exactly what we were talking about on this visit. And they said, nope, you got it. We're going to give you everything that the NCAA allows us to give you. So that was a relief. And then after talking to my parents a little bit and just kind of checking out the campus, I decided to commit right then and there that weekend. And I wanted to make sure, too, that Michigan State looked like I had envisioned my college experience looking like. I wanted to make sure the campus, was a college town, kind of a community feel, even though it was a bigger school with a lot of students. I wanted, that vision to line up with reality. So that definitely happened. And, luckily I signed not long after that. And I'm so glad that I did.
That's awesome. I mean, listen, having spent 4 years in East Lansing, I'm biased, but I mean, I've been to a lot of college towns, but I mean, it sort of fits the profile, right, of the perfect college town. Huge campus, a lot of students, but it really is a small community. It's a great place to go to school.
Oh, absolutely. You got the stadium, which is right in the middle of campus, amid all the other academic buildings. You've got a nice river that runs, right through campus. It's really picturesque, and I just love it. I loved it so much that I decided to stick around. The stadium and the campus is about 5 miles down the road from where I'm at now.
Yeah. I'll never forget my freshman year, and I'm a little bit older than you, but I grew up in the East, and I've never experienced college football. We're pro football out where I grew up in Long Island, right? It's Jets and Giants, and we didn't really have any major college football. So I remember early in the season, my freshman year, I think it was the first football game at home, and they were playing Northwestern. And I woke up, I lived right in Case Hall across from the Munn Ice Arena parking lot, the grass. And I look out the window, I'm like, what the hell is going on here? There was 1,000 cars out there at 8:00 in the morning. And I didn't realize that there was a tailgate. I had no idea. And I was like, what is going on in this place? But people were crazy about it. And eventually I figured it out and I learned to love it. But it's just a different universe. And so to have the opportunity to play football in Spartan Stadium in front of some really great fans, that must have been a very, very cool experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious, what brought you from New Jersey all the way to East Lansing?
You know what? Dumb luck. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life in college because I was an athlete in high school. I started 3 years football, 2 years baseball, but I was a 210-pound center and I wasn't going anywhere with football for sure. And baseball didn't work out. So it was like, well, I don't really know what I want to do with myself. And I just knew I didn't want to stay home. And my high school guidance counselor went to Michigan State, strangely enough. And she's like, you should try it. You'd love it there. And you'll be able to get in. The standards were much, much lower then than they are now, which I think have come up extremely high in terms of getting in academically. I was the last school I applied to, the first one I got into, and it was either stay home or go. And I was like, I'm going. So I went and showed up on campus and learned to live in the Midwest. And I was an East Coast kid with a thick accent, and it took a while to adjust. But my second year, I was really settled in, and I just loved it. I loved the environment. It was just a great place to be. And so did you have any, I was wondering, did you have any dreams or desires to play at Ohio State or Penn State because of your background and where you came from?
I didn't. I didn't have a clear-cut college team that I loved as much as I loved the Pittsburgh Steelers. Mm-hmm. So I went and checked out the University of Pittsburgh. That was right downtown. Went to see a game there. Penn State was okay. I actually really didn't like Ohio State at that time. They were more of a an I formation, run the football type of organization. But it really comes down to you want to go where you're wanted, and I didn't really get any of that from Ohio State. That's one of the big reasons why I wanted to go to the University of Maryland there for a little while, because they were showing a very strong interest in me. I actually went down to a game at Ohio State just on an unofficial visit, and I remember being at the get together there for the football team, and nobody talked to me. There were no coaches that even knew who I was. I could have just been a face in the crowd, and it wouldn't have mattered. So you don't really want to pursue a place where you don't feel welcomed. And so no, to answer your question, I really didn't have a major college team that I loved.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So tell me about, you make the choice to go to Michigan State, and you arrive on campus as a freshman football player. What was that like for you, going from high school in Ohio to being a freshman on a campus in the Big Ten playing football?
It was definitely a shock to the system. When you're a high school player, at least when I was a high school player, your day of school lets out, you go down to the football field and you're there for a couple hours at practice, and then you go home. And that's really it. When I showed up on campus to report for freshman camp, I thought I would just kind of check in. I'd be able to kind of walk around campus with my parents, check it out, just kind of take it easy that day and slowly get myself acclimated to college life. And that was not the case at all. I mean, you showed up, you were issued gear, you were given a strength test, you were giving an eye test, a complete physical. You had to run 1.5 miles. You had to do all sorts of testing. You had to go take academic tests. I basically said goodbye to my parents the second that we walked up to the registration table. And I didn't see them really until the very next day. I think they went to get me a bike, buy me a bike to have on campus. And, it was a whirlwind of just activities and itineraries. And it really never stopped, in 5 years that I was there. You do learn to adjust a little bit, and you do learn where you can kind of steal some rest and some relaxation, of course, as you get older. But that first initial freshman camp was really, really difficult because it was just all football. There was not even any going to class at that point because the regular students were not on campus. Class had not started. And the upperclassmen on the football team had not reported yet. Those first 3 days were just all freshmen. And so we were taking every single rep in practice, and we were just exhausted. We did get a little relief when the upperclassmen showed up because now they've got to get their reps in because they're going to be doing most of the playing during the game. So we got some more rest, which was a relief. But the big difference from high school to college for me were the number of meetings. I mean, it wasn't just the 2.5 hours on the practice field. It was anytime there was any extra time at all. If you weren't eating or practicing, you were watching film in a meeting room or installing plays. And that was really difficult. That takes some stamina, from an 18-year-old high school kid who's used to just practicing 2 hours a day and then going home. And, you've really got to zero in and realize that football is now your main job, and it's not a high school level anymore. You've committed to this, and this is what it takes in order to be successful. But the nice thing was, you were in the same boat with a lot of other freshmen, so you could kind of lean on each other, and that's really what makes the camaraderie so great. Is you're not the only one going through it. So without question, it was a huge adjustment.
So I'm curious, like in retrospect, right, looking back at high school, do you think there's anything you could have done in high school from a mental preparation standpoint to have prepared you for that transition? Or do you think that no matter what you did, it was just going to be, to use the proverbial drinking through the fire hose?
Well, I think so, but I think it's really, really difficult. Some of these guys, some of these athletes now who have somebody in their life who's been through it and who also have the almost maniacal desire to do it can set themselves up in high school to kind of almost be that self-disciplined to set up some things for themselves that will be similar to what they're going to go through. But, again, just being me and not really knowing at all what I was getting into, it was definitely a shock to my system. So to answer your question, if I had to say yes or no, I would guess the answer would be no. I mean, it's very difficult to duplicate that process. It's just from the time you open your eyes in the morning till, the time you go to bed at night, sun up to sundown. And I can actually remember, you mentioned Munn Field, the field that you referenced across from your dorm. I remember we were actually staying in that dormitory during that freshman camp. And at this time in Michigan, there was something called the Michigan Fest. And it was a big concert, a big festival. And it was right on campus. And we were in the dorm at night. It was dark. We had just finished a long day. And now the students were back. The non-athlete students, the regular students were back on campus. And on the side of the dorm it was all glass. So you could see out to the field from the stairwell. And little did we know that at the time, this was the mid-'90s. So Hootie and the Blowfish was a big musical group, popular musical group at the time. And they were headlining this festival, and we look out and that field is all lit up, and there are thousands and thousands of college students out there just having, the time of their lives. And we were locked in this dorm, and we had curfew, we had bed check. We could not leave. We couldn't go check it out, and come back. That was not even a thought. So it was very difficult because you see what you're missing and you realize what a sacrifice it is. But I wouldn't trade it for the world. It definitely is an experience that not everybody gets to have. And I think a lot of those people on that field, those students, would have traded with us, at least, at first thought, without knowing the sacrifice and the work that it takes. But there are definitely trade-offs.
Big time. So when you were there as a freshman, who's in the quarterback room? Jim Miller, Tony Banks?
Tony Banks was in his senior year. Jim Miller had already graduated. So it was Tony Banks. There was Todd Schultz, who was a year behind Jim, maybe two. And I think it was my freshman year. A guy named Gus Ornstein had been a huge recruit nationally for Notre Dame, had gone to Notre Dame, then transferred in to Michigan State. So before he did that, I think I was the only quarterback in my recruiting class to go to Michigan State. So when he signed up, I thought, wow, this is going to be even more competitive than I thought. And he was such a big time recruit that everybody thought he was just going to kind of step in and take over once, the guys above us were gone. And then, of course, there was always a handful of walk-ons. Our quarterback room got pretty big at times. But a lot of good guys, a lot of different personalities, and that's really one of the cool parts of being a college athlete. And football specifically, you're on a team with 100 other people, from all different parts of the country, all different backgrounds, and you're going through this really difficult experience. And so you've got to find creative ways to make each other laugh and to just get through the tough times. So yeah, it was definitely an interesting quarterback room, and I really feel fortunate that I had the opportunity to watch a guy like Tony Banks, who ended up being a second round draft pick in the NFL, definitely an NFL quarterback, and I would watch him every day at practice and just be amazed at his natural throwing ability. I never saw the guy throw a pass that wasn't a perfect spiral, and I'm not exaggerating. And everybody throws a wobbler now and again. I don't know what it was about his motion, but it was just a perfect spiral every single time. And really, he made a lot of the right reads. Our offensive coordinator and quarterback coach at the time was a very difficult guy, very demanding, expected perfection. And Tony was the only guy that really never got yelled at during practice. And it was amazing. And then he graduated and left, and all of us guys that remained just got ripped by Coach Tranquil every single day of practice, which was very difficult to go through, but he got the best out of us. But at the same time, it was kind of a common bond with us as well, because we could all just laugh at how much, we all got yelled at and criticized, but he got the best out of us for sure.
I want to ask you about your progression from freshman to senior, but I just, as I was thinking about Tony Banks, because I was there with Jim Miller. Jim Miller was a starter when I came in, and then Tony Banks came in. But then I think about all the guys that were on that team or in those years: Muhsin Muhammad, Derek Mason. I mean, these are like borderline Hall of Fame kind of guys. To have the opportunity to play football with them and learn from those kinds of guys, it had to be really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned a couple of those guys. Muhsin Muhammad was an NFL guy. Derek Mason played in the league for I don't know how many years. Just great receivers. I got an opportunity earlier in my career as a redshirt freshman and as a redshirt sophomore to throw to a couple of those guys. Derek Mason, I got a couple of starts when I was younger because of injuries. Derek Mason, I enjoyed watching him in the NFL. He was the quintessential slot receiver, just could get open, find those spots in the zones and make the play on third down when you needed it. It was very cool to not just to play with them at the time, but then to see where their careers went in the NFL and just to kind of think back to when I was with them and, some of the things I learned and how those guys made me better, because I had to kind of step up my game in order to play at that level.
I can only imagine. And then having the opportunity of played for Nick Saban, who at the time, none of us would have predicted what his career would become. But what was that experience like playing for him?
Well, if you follow college football today and you get a glimpse of him on the sideline, nothing has really changed. I mean, it was exactly the same way, back in the mid-'90s at Michigan State. He was very difficult, very demanding. I could tell stories about how detail-oriented he was. He certainly was at a different spot in his career, so he was trying to make a name for himself. And I think by his own admission, he was maybe a little bit too demanding at times, just trying to get the program turned around, because when he took over, there were some NCAA violations and probation. So he was trying to really change the culture. And the guys that were there before he showed up and stayed there after he came into the program really noticed the difference. I didn't really have that luxury because I was in his first recruiting class. So that's all I knew. But he was very, very demanding, all year round. The off-season program, spring ball in the summer, just knew exactly what his system was and what he wanted it to be. And, very, very direct and to the point. If you're not going to be involved in the program and buy in, then you're probably not going to be around very long. But that's what it took to, turn the program around and to start getting it headed in the right direction, get some big wins. And that's what it takes. It's not always easy. Doesn't always look pretty, but he definitely is, as you can tell, the greatest college football coach of all time for very specific reasons. And, I've talked about it on my show, with a couple of guys that have played with him or for him as well. And, it's interesting. There's so many other coaches that really try and duplicate what he's doing, but really can't do it. And so it's fascinating to me why that is. And he's just got that it factor that, he's got his system down, and a lot of it, I think, is just innate in him. I think a lot of it is his upbringing. And if you read about that, that's very interesting and very in line with his philosophies and his style of coaching now. So it definitely was difficult, no question about it, but I wouldn't change it for the world because I learned so much about, what it takes to be successful. And most of that came from Nick Saban.
So what was that progression like from the time you walk in on campus to the point where you're a senior and you're starting for Nick Saban? Like, talk me through kind of what that looks like through those 4 or 5 years that you're there, in the quarterback room.
Well, my first year I was redshirted. Second year I'm now a redshirt freshman. And Tony Banks is now graduated. And I think, as you know, backup quarterback is the most popular position on the field, not just with the fans, but with some of the coaches sometimes as well. Because, as a coach, I'm trying to put myself in their shoes, and you're always looking to upgrade. You're always looking to increase the quality of talent on your squad. And I think as a young coach, Nick Saban was constantly trying to do that. So when I was a backup and a young guy as a redshirt freshman, redshirt sophomore, I could tell that, the coaches weren't thrilled with Todd Schultz or the other starters. So, I could move around a little bit. I wasn't the fastest guy, but I was a little more mobile than some of the other guys. So I had made a couple of plays, scrambling for a first down or something like that. And I was pretty good with my the intelligence side of the game. I got to the point where I learned the offense really well, and I kind of figured out how to impress the coaches that way. If they signaled in a play from the sideline before they even completed the signals, I would just turn to the huddle and start calling the plays because I could put the formation with the play together. It was like putting a puzzle together. And I think they appreciated that. You want to be able to know that your quarterback, if something goes wrong or if there's not enough time to get the whole play in, you can kind of piece that together when you need to. And so I was able to kind of figure out how to set myself apart that way. But I got some starts as a redshirt freshman. I know my very first start was absolutely awful. I was so nervous. I think my first 7 or 8 passes during the game were nowhere close, and most of them were actually end over end. Well, the part of the problem was I found out like an hour before the game that I was going to be starting. I was sitting in the locker room, and one of the assistants said, "Hey, Bill, Nick wants to see you in his office in the stadium." And I said, "I didn't realize Coach had an office in the stadium." So I walked out of our locker room. It was actually across the tunnel and over by the visitors' locker room. So I had to ask somebody where it was. And anyway, he's sitting there and he says, you could see he was kind of agonizing over the decision, but he says, "You're going to start." I can't remember what else he said, but I just was extremely nervous. Went out there. Like I said, my first 8 or 9 passes weren't even close, but my first completion was actually a long touchdown pass. And after that, I just kind of settled down. Went on to play, pretty well. We won the game pretty easily against Eastern Michigan. Coach Saban, after on the field, said, that he thought I played pretty well. And I didn't say this, but I kind of disagreed with him in my own head because of, how I started the game. It was just ugly and awful. But the next week went on the road against Iowa. Again, was a little nervous, threw a couple touchdown passes, though we ended up losing the game late, and played sparingly, throughout the next couple of years as the starter would come back from injury, get healthy, sometimes get injured again. So finally got my time as a junior. Everybody above me had graduated, and I thought it was finally my turn. But I actually did realize that the coaches had some other ideas in mind. Now I'm a junior, and they have just recruited a hotshot true freshman from the state of Michigan, Ryan Van Dyke, who I actually had on my show, episode 3. And he was a much higher recruit, than I was, and they wanted to get him on the field and get him some playing time. So first game of that year, we actually shared time, and he's a true freshman. I'm a junior. We ended up losing that game against Colorado State. The next week at Oregon, we got crushed. He actually got injured, and it was out for several weeks and battled some injuries for most of that season. We were very inconsistent that year as a team. We really didn't know what our identity was. We would beat, a highly ranked Notre Dame team, but then lose to a Minnesota team that was unranked. Finally got to the point late in the season when Ryan got healthy. We still went back to sharing time, and now we're going down to Columbus to take on the number 1 Ohio State Buckeyes. And, that's my home state. I'm excited. And I find out, before the game that we're going to be sharing time again. And I really was not happy about that at all. I'd kind of, really been so tight and put so much pressure on myself, and thinking about becoming the starter. My dream was right there on the doorstep. And it just seemed like no matter how close I got to it, it just kept getting pulled a little further away from me. So we were told we were going to share time again, but I started the game. We got hot early, made some big completions, made some big plays, and much to Nick Saban's credit, he just left me on the field. I never came out, and so I was thrilled about that. There were a lot of ups and downs during the game, and if you want to hear the story about, we were 28-point underdogs going into that game against the number 1 team in the country. Nobody thought we could win. We were unranked. We were 4-4 at that time. And late in the third quarter, it was 17-9. We were down. We were in the game, though. We were very, very encouraged about where we were at that point. And I threw an interception that got returned for a touchdown. And it was just really devastating to me because I knew that we were in that game, and I did not want to be the reason that we lost that game. And, I came off the field really upset with myself. Coach Saban tried to talk to me. I didn't really give him the time to do that. He just kind of turned back to the field and kept coaching. But we went on to win that game, which was fantastic. Finished that season 6-6, did not go to a bowl game. And then my senior year, again, now we're a year older, a little more mature. We've got an identity. We start the season off kind of hot with a win against Oregon, and a couple of games into the season, it's clear that we are a different team this year, and had some big wins that year. Started the season off 6-0, beat Notre Dame, beat Tom Brady in Michigan. The next 2 weeks we lost to Purdue and Wisconsin. And that's what I referenced earlier. I think Nick Saban would admit, or he actually said in some book, that he just kind of wore us out, and didn't give us enough rest to recuperate, at that point in the season. So lost those games, they weren't even close. But we recovered, won the rest of our games, finished the regular season 9-2, and then went on to beat Florida in the Citrus Bowl. Finished that year ranked number 7 in the country. And for me personally, that was really the last college game, really the last football game that I ever played in my career, but it was a great way to go out.
Yeah. So, obviously when you mentioned beating Tom Brady, that's something that you can never, you could take with you forever. But I think think about playing Purdue in 1999, I would have to say that Drew Brees was the starting quarterback on the other side. So you played against some pretty damn good football players.
Yeah, it was a tough conference that year. It really was difficult. Ron Dane won the Heisman Trophy. He ran all over us at Wisconsin. So the Big Ten was extremely tough at that point. A lot of people, ask me about the Ohio State game in '98. They ask me what my favorite game is. The bowl game, obviously, with Florida. But my favorite game is my senior year against Michigan for a couple of reasons. 2 years earlier, Michigan and Michigan State were both undefeated going into that game. There was a lot of hype, and Michigan won that game pretty easily. So that was kind of the wrap on Michigan State. They'd start off the season pretty hot, then they'd fall apart midway through, and we didn't want to be that team that did that anymore. So that year, we both were undefeated again, and College Game Day was there. They were ranked 3rd. We were ranked 11th, I think. And, we just knew from the very beginning that we had them, and for as many yards as I threw for and as many points as we scored and all the records we broke, it really came down to our offensive and defensive lines really pushed them around more than they pushed us around. And that was really the difference in the game, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. But it was really fun, actually, to watch our defense just harass Tom Brady and also Drew Henson at the time. And then we got over that hump. We won that elusive game against Michigan to remain undefeated. And I'll never forget when that game was over, none of the fans got up and really left the stadium. Everybody just kind of stayed and celebrated, and it was just a really cool scene. It was good to do that at home as well. It's always nice to win those big games in front of the home crowd as well. So, yeah, that's one I'll never forget.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure. Now, I'm going to indulge myself here as a fan. So when Michigan State beat Notre Dame in '99, that was under the lights, right? Were you the starter for that game?
That was '98. That was my junior year. We played at Notre Dame during the day in '99.
Okay. No, because I was living in Chicago at the time, and I remember watching that game with a bunch of Domers who end up being close friends of mine to this day, and it was like 42-3 at halftime, and Julian Peterson ran back that touchdown, and I'll never forget it. They hate me forever for that because I was so obnoxious because they were talking so much smack all week about how they were going to kill us. So I'll never forget that. It's total non sequitur, but I had to bring it up.
Well, that was a weird game because it was one of the few games I've ever been a part of where it literally felt like it didn't matter what we did, it was going to go right. The ball just bounced into people's hands the right way. Every pass was where you wanted it to go. We had big punt returns. It just was one of those nights. I think that was only the second night game in school history, and it was just the stars were lined up for us, and really wouldn't have mattered what Notre Dame did. We were going to come out on top.
It seemed that way. So, it's senior year. It's a great way to go out 9-2, bowl win, beat Brady. All those things. And now it's over. So talk to me about that. Like when it ended, like what were you thinking in the season's over? Where did you think your career would go? And sort of what did that transition look like for you out of football?
Yeah, well, I had the dream like everybody else does of playing in the NFL. And again, maybe I was a little naive. I hadn't got any word about, where I might be drafted or if I'd be drafted at all. I started to, obviously you get contacted by agents. So I started to have a few meetings just to kind of line somebody up, in that respect. Got invited to the NFL Combine, so started to train for that. Didn't really know what to expect there either. Threw in the indoor field on campus at Michigan State as much as I could find some guys that would catch for me. Actually was sent down to Florida by my agent to train in the Orlando area just to get ready for the Combine. That was a great experience, but again, that's a very difficult experience as well. There's a lot of downtime. There's a lot of sitting around. There's a lot of medical evaluations. You do get to interview with some of the teams that want to talk to you. You talk about, your favorite play or coverages, defenses, those types of things. Going through a lot of tests again. Was very hopeful, and the draft day rolled around. Did not get drafted. was disappointed by that, obviously, but signed as a free agent with the New York Giants. And again, you got to believe that you can play at that level, and you got to believe that you're there and you're going to accomplish something when you're there. Looking back on it now, I think I was just kind of an extra arm in camp. They were pretty well set at the quarterback position. But while you're there, you're trying to do everything you can to compete and to make a name for yourself in the short period of time that you have there, and the small number of reps that you're actually given as a free agent. It's tough to make an impression when you're not really getting those reps in practice. Didn't play in any of the preseason games, so I was released there right before the season. We actually played 3 preseason games, and then after the Jets game, I was released. That's a difficult thing to endure as well. You're laying in a hotel room, on a Saturday morning, the phone rings and the coach says, hey, can you bring your playbook over and come meet with the coaches? But they were very gracious and, very nice on my exit interviews. Just kind of trained and continued to keep the dream alive. The following spring, my agent was able to get me another tryout with the Washington Redskins at the time. That was just a weekend deal. Didn't make that team, at that point. Actually tried to play with the first version of the XFL, went down to training camp in Florida, if you remember that far back. Didn't really have a great experience here. That was a difficult organization to try and get off the ground. It was totally different from what I experienced in college. There wasn't a lot of organization going on. A lot of the coaches hadn't coached in 20 years. So at that point, I just said, there's not a lot of opportunities here for me in football. I think I'm just going to start to look towards the next chapter of my life. And so that's what I decided to do. But, the further I've gotten away from my career and the more I've been able to reflect on it, in a lot of ways, I was very, very fortunate to have the career that I did. And I'm just so thankful for all the experiences because there are guys that are much more highly recruited out of high school, much more talented than I am. But for whatever reasons, a lot of them out of their control, for whatever reasons, they just don't get to experience some of the great things that I did. So I'm very grateful for it.
That's awesome. And so what was your next move professionally once you accepted that football was over?
Well, I was just trying to figure it out. I gravitated back towards the East Lansing area. That's where I'd spent the last 5 years of my life and really had made some contacts there and felt comfortable there. Like we talked about a while ago, that was just kind of a very comfortable environment in and around campus for me. So I tried to just, try a lot of new things. Wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Tried some broadcasting, tried some business endeavors in terms of, different career paths. Wanted to stay as close to the game as I could. I knew I didn't want to coach because I had witnessed up close and personal how difficult and demanding that was. Maybe it was just coaching for Nick Saban, but I saw a lot of the time that was dedicated to being a college coach. I would love to be doing it even to this day, but I think the lifestyle is just not something that I wanted to have. So I did some broadcasting, Michigan State Radio, did some TV broadcasting nationally. I think it's all about just trying new things until you figure out or find something that you really like to do. And sometimes that happens very quickly and sometimes that takes, quite a bit of time. And so I think, for me, I'm always trying new things. I'm always looking to pursue things that I'm passionate about and things that kind of light me up. So I don't know that there's ever a destination for that, but it's definitely a lot of fun going through those experiences and learning not just what's out there, but learning more about yourself as well in the process.
Yeah, well, I think that, you and I are very similar in that respect. This is my second career is in the sports psychology field. It was not anything I ever thought about doing for the longest time. And then I made the switch and it just has been amazing. And then you get into that field and then all of a sudden you're doing a podcast, and that's something you can relate to because you're doing a podcast as well. So can you talk about the Drop Back podcast and what that's all about?
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about my experience as a college quarterback, and I just found myself sitting around saying, number one, who else had this similar experience to me as a high-level quarterback, and what was their experience like during their playing days, and what's it been like for them after their playing days ended, because I certainly had my struggles and my reflections and wanted to hear from other guys around the country who really I never had the chance to connect with. So it's been very rewarding from that perspective. But also, at times since my career ended, because football was such a huge part of my life and my identity, I found myself feeling like I wasn't reaching my full potential. I found myself saying, there's got to be some more things out there that I know aren't necessarily on par with what I experienced in my athletic career, but I know that I have more to give and more to learn, and I want to stretch myself a little bit. So, what can I do to make some connections and in the process, have an impact on other people who might be listening to the show. So hopefully all three of those things, and hopefully there's some other things that I'm not even aware of, some potential benefits from the show kind of all come together, and hopefully the listeners are gaining some value from it. And I know I'm learning a ton in the process, not just from my guests, but about myself. And it's really helped me to kind of, move in the direction of feeling like I'm giving back and I'm having an impact on other people as well.
Are there any themes that you could put your finger on that have come out of some of the conversations you've had with former quarterbacks in terms of what their experiences are? Like anything that jumps out at you as being something that consistently comes up as something that their experiences, are that's unique, or something that's always sort of pops up when you talk to people?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I only interview current and former quarterbacks. So it's a very unique perspective that these guys have, and it's a very unique fraternity. So, we talk a lot about leadership, and it's interesting to hear everybody's different takes on leadership and their definitions of that. It's also really interesting to hear, guys talk about the mental side of the game. We could certainly, talk for an hour about footwork and arm mechanics and all that, but really what is more interesting to me and the questions that I tend to ask are things around mindset, preparation. What do you do when you throw 2 interceptions that get returned for touchdowns to start the game, like my last guest did when he was in college? How do you handle that when 70,000 people are sitting in the stands looking at you, wondering how you're going to handle that? They came to see their hometown team win, and you just started the game by, throwing a big interception, as I have done myself in a big game. What do you do? What lesson do you learn from that? Because everybody's going to face adversity in their lives, and most people don't face adversity and then have the clock ticking on when they've got to go back out on the field and try it again, with millions of people watching on TV. So there's so many different themes that we'd like to talk about. Obviously, the intelligence necessary for processing lots of information in a small amount of time, making quick decisions, not only overcoming adversity, but handling success. How do you handle success? How do you kind of detach from your identity once your career ends? Those are all things that not a lot of current athletes take the time to think about, but certainly once your career's over, you've got a lot of time to reflect back on what it all means.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just started working with a high school quarterback recently, and I understand football probably better than the average bear, but I'm by no means an expert. But it's interesting, when you start to talk to a quarterback and think about the demands of the position. I mean, to me, it's the single most difficult thing to do in all of team sports because of all the things that you mentioned. And as a mental performance coach, I think the thing that fascinates me the most out of all those things, and they're all important and interesting, is the decision-making process, right? Understanding what your reads are, understanding where you want to go with the ball, where do you put it, anticipation, focus. And, what I talk to kids a lot about, and maybe you can comment on this because you've been in it, is, obviously every system is different, right? You have different reads, you have a progression of reads as a quarterback. But just because there's a first read doesn't mean there's only one right decision, right? And talking to kids about, as young athletes, about decision making and saying like, maybe that was the best decision, but there's probably one or two other good decisions that go, right behind it. And just because you didn't make the best decision doesn't mean you made the wrong decision either. And I think that that's something that's hard for athletes to understand because there's such a high level of perfectionism, especially in elite athletes. Like, I should have done this and I should have done it perfectly. And if I didn't, I'm a failure.
Yeah, well said. There's so much, pressure and scrutiny and eyeballs on you, especially at a high
Yeah.
level in a major sport. And that's not even taking into consideration the pressure that you put on yourself, because as you mentioned, so many athletes chase perfection, and it's difficult to tell yourself that even though we're chasing that perfection, it's unattainable. We chase it in hopes that we catch excellence, to quote Vince Lombardi,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really unattainable. But if you can understand that and simultaneously still almost trick yourself into pursuing that, knowing that you're going to become the best version of yourself, then I think you're on the road, to excellence. But it's very difficult to do. It's much more of a mind game with yourself than it is a competition against your opponent. And the quicker you can figure that out and almost not only embrace that, but take pride in that mental war that you have with yourself, the better athlete you're going to be. One of the biggest things you can learn, and one of the biggest things I had to learn at Michigan State, was to almost, take pride in getting knocked down and being able to get back up, not just literally, but figuratively. You have to almost go on the offensive, in terms of wanting that responsibility and wanting that adversity, knowing that each time you face it, you're going to build up that muscle even more. I think as a young kid at 18, 19, when you get knocked down or you run up against something that's hard or you get yelled at by a coach, your first reaction because of your immaturity is to kind of focus on yourself and how you're feeling and, why is this happening to me? Play the victim instead of, more of the player mentality, which is bring it on. I don't care what it is. I'm going to handle it. And there aren't many other people that can do what I'm about to do. And the confidence that comes from that is really, really, once you cross that threshold, it's something that can stay with you forever.
Well, and I think about this in terms of my work with high school athletes is because when you're in high school, most athletes that go on to compete in college, and I don't care where or at what level, most of those athletes are better than everybody else in high school. And so when you go to college, you're one of many, and you're probably not as good as the other people around you. And so dealing with adversity is a new thing for a lot of athletes. And I couldn't help but think about Tom Brady in that instance. What makes Tom Brady, in my opinion, what he is his ability to bounce back from mistakes and to have this, like, he's almost like a cornerback in the sense that if you get burned, you come back and you just forget about it. And that's, I have to imagine too, some of the adversity he faced at Michigan. Think about it. He wasn't a full-time player. The greatest quarterback in the history of the NFL split time with Drew Henson for pretty much his whole career. And he was the 199th pick. So he learned how to deal with adversity, which I'm sure has served him in spades in the NFL because he's learned how to take a beating mentally for 4 years at Michigan.
No question about it. I saw a lot of players that were highly recruited on my team, and the first time they ran up against some adversity, they didn't handle it well and eventually kind of just fizzled out of the program. So everybody's got a decision to make. And, I don't know where that decision comes from. I don't know where you find the, the fortitude and the courage to say, yeah, I'm going to believe in myself and keep going no matter what. I'm sure it has a lot to do with, a person's or an athlete's upbringing and their parents and their environment. But, you've got a decision to make. How good do you want to be and how bad do you want it? But the earlier an athlete can understand that, and really every human being, not just athletes, but you are going to face adversity, not just now, but forever, whether it's a little bit, it's a lot, it's a small thing, it's a big thing. Just accept it now and start working on your reaction to that, because that really is where the magic happens. I think a lot of young people really naively expect to go through, a lot of these hard things and never face any adversity. And that's just not reality. So if you can kind of have that mindset and that perspective that it's going to happen, then I think you're one step ahead of everybody else already.
Just a couple more questions before we wrap up here. So I want to go back to something you just said about a minute ago. How did you, when you were playing, right? You're playing in Michigan Stadium, Spartan Stadium, the Horseshoe. How did you cope with those situations where you made a mistake that maybe was debilitating or embarrassing? How did you bounce back in game from those adversities?
Well, again, it's definitely a muscle. And as a quarterback, I looked at it as being fortunate. You're almost forced to forget about the last play because the clock is ticking. Whether you just threw the worst pass ever or you made the best pass ever, that play clock starts immediately, and you've got to get the next play and you've got to move on. So you've got to develop that short memory. You've got to forget about it. There were many times after the game where I would talk to the media and they'd ask me about a specific pass in the second quarter, and I had no idea what they were talking about because as soon as it happens, it's forgotten. And I'll go back and watch it on tape the next day, but I just do not have time or space in my brain to think about that or to analyze it. You've got to do it. And like you mentioned earlier, you've got to get to the point where you almost have that unconscious competence where you're not even thinking, you're just reacting. And that's why coaches tell their players, you want to get to the point where you can just play fast, because when you're not thinking, that gives you the freedom to play fast and just react. And so if you can do that, then you're going to be a lot better off. You see guys all the time who just make a bad play in a game on TV. They come off, the camera's on them, and they just can't shake it off, and it affects the next play. Even if you threw the best touchdown that's ever been seen on television, if you're thinking about that and mentally patting yourself on the back, you're not going to be in the zone and focused on the next play or the next series. So you've got to forget it. And, it's almost, again, you've got to develop that sense of pride in having that ability to forget. I mean, that's really why we are quarterbacks, why we want to play the position. We want all that responsibility on us. We want the risk of making the big mistake, but also the potential of making, that big play that wins the game.
Yeah, I think the gold standard for that today in football is Russell Wilson. Like, if you pay attention to what he's doing in his mental work in terms of trying to attain neutral thinking, right? Like, if I do something good, don't put a value on it. If I do something bad, don't put a value on it. Just stay in the present moment and do what's in front of you. And I think that's really, it's simple, but it makes a lot of sense. And I think it's really hard. And if I'm being biased, like, that's something that athletes have to practice, right? Being mindful and being mindful enough to know that stuff doesn't matter now. Only what matters is what's going on here in the moment. But I don't think it's certainly not instinctive, and that's not the way the brain works. The brain is wired to go to the negative. And so you've got to put in the effort and time to combat that, right? To be okay with whatever happened, I'm going to move on. And that's just not that easy. And so quarterbacks or any athlete that have that skill, I think, are naturally going to have an advantage because they're not caught up in what happened before or what's going to happen next.
Yeah, so I think the work that you're doing is great. And you mentioned, Russell Wilson, and so much of what you just described is also related to the language that you use. It's not just about, saying positive things like you mentioned. It's about not saying negative things, because I think I read somewhere negativity or negative comments have 5 times the impact on positive ones or something like that. So That's pretty powerful when you have that knowledge, as a lot more athletes do today. I certainly didn't know that when I played, but again, it's like anything else. And young athletes today should feel good that they can practice that, just like they practice throwing a ball or shooting a basketball or any of the other skills that they're working on. So they've got a lot of advantages today if they choose to take care or take advantage of some of those resources.
Yeah. So last question for you. If you had to give one piece of advice to a young quarterback aspiring to play in college and beyond, what would that piece of advice be?
Well, I would say you got to love it, and if you do love it, then you got to understand that you got to put in the work, and it's not going to be easy. You almost, again, have to take pride in the fact that it's hard, and it's really hard, and you got to love the fact that not everybody can do it. Not everybody is willing to do it. You're going to have friends who are going to be, playing video games till 1 a.m. And if you want to be a quarterback at a high level, and I'm just using that as an example, but you can't do that. You can't do what everybody else is doing. You can't, like I told you the story, that freshman camp that I was in looking out the window, you can't go to that concert.
Right.
There are thousands of people that are at that concert. You can't be there because you're about to, in a couple of weeks, run out of the tunnel at Spartan Stadium in front of 75,000 people. And not one person on that field at that concert is going to be able to do that along with you. So if you can make those sacrifices and understand that not just making sacrifices, but you're going to have to at times suffer for what you really want to ultimately do.
Mm-hmm.
If you can understand that and be okay with that, then you're going to have a real shot.
That's a great way to end. I couldn't agree more. So, Bill, I just want to thank you for coming on. I really enjoyed talking to you. Even 25 years after we were in college together, we didn't know each other, and now we're here on a podcast having a conversation. So thanks so much for coming on.
Absolutely, Michael. Thanks for having me. It was an honor, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. Same to you. Take care, Bill. So, what was your biggest takeaway from my conversation with Bill Burke? For me, it was that the life lessons we learn from sports are much bigger than the glory of our playing days. Bill followed a rocky path to Michigan State, put in the time and effort required to elevate himself to starting quarterback, and ultimately achieve great results through persistent hard work and sacrifice. Further, Bill has successfully applied the lessons learned on the field and in the quarterback room to his life after football. My suggestion to high school student athletes would be to believe in yourself and remain patient in your athletic pursuits. While things may not always unfold the way you expect, the lessons learned through hard work and patience will last a lifetime. I want to thank Bill for his kind generosity and the wisdom he shared with the Freshman Foundation community. You can learn more about Bill on social media at Dropback, DROPBAQ, and dropback.com. You can learn more about the Freshman Foundation on our website at freshmanfoundation.com. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you back for episode 15.
Mike Huber is the founder and owner of Follow the Ball Coaching, located in Fairhaven, New Jersey. He is a mental performance coach and business advisor dedicated to serving athletes just like you reach their full potential on and off the court. The Freshman Foundation is all about helping you get to the next level. For more information, follow along on Instagram at the Freshman Foundation. Please subscribe, give us a like on iTunes, Spotify, leave a review, tell a friend. Most importantly, come back in 2 weeks, ready to get better.